Hi everyone, and thanks for taking a moment to check out Presto. My name is Steven, and I'm the developer behind the project. Presto is an HTML componentization framework that aims to make managing your markup both easier and more modular. So if we take a look at the hero image here, you can kind of get a rough idea of what I mean by that. Here on the left, we've got a traditional HTML document that's pretty lengthy and may not have a real system of organization. And then on the right, this would be its ideal equivalent in Presto. A whole lot more organized and broken down into its different components, represented by their own expressions. So that's the basic idea, and I describe it here on the repo as syntactically-natural magic markup componentization with specialties for Alpine JS. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be using Alpine to also use Presto, but there's a lot of really cool things you can accomplish if you do. So if you haven't already, check out the Alpine repo or the video that Jeffrey Way made over at Laracast. It'll give you a great place to get started with Alpine. Now, all of that being said, whether you use Alpine or you don't, if you're already familiar with plain old HTML, then you should have no trouble getting up and running with Presto. I really tried to stick to this syntactically natural part of the tagline, which to me means that when you're working in Presto and writing your components, it behaves in the ways that you'd expect from conventional HTML. So if we take a look at the hero image down here again, we can see some of what I mean by this. Even though we're working with component expressions, we can still apply any HTML attributes that we want onto those, and Presto will coalesce them onto the markup that each component represents, just as if we were writing plain old HTML. So here you can see that I've got xShow, which is an Alpine attribute, and it's going to be applied to whatever happens to be within this modals component. Now, there's a lot of really cool things that you can do to control the way that this behaves, and it's all pretty much documented here in the README, but we're not going to dive too heavily into that. If you're interested in learning more, come visit the repository, show Presto some love, and feel free to open an issue if you have a question, a suggestion, or anything else. All right, so if you're watching this, there's a really good chance that you're already familiar with Alpine, but even if you're not, just kind of stick along for the ride and we'll learn as we go. Between Laracast and the actual documentation for Alpine itself, there's plenty of great resources to get started, so make sure to drop by either one later on if you need a little bit more. All right, so what we're going to do is build an admin dashboard to track some different statistics. This is something you'd probably see in like an enterprise or an industrial environment. And we're going to start with this really awesome looking template that comes from Tailwind Toolbox. I've got a fake API set up in the background that's being run by an Express app. And we can see that if I refresh it here in Insomnia, it's returning to us just an array of objects that basically has a name, a trend, an alarm value, a value of itself, and a type. So I think the idea behind this was that it was supposed to be kind of like a power plant or some kind of refinery or something, but that's really not important. We're going to plug our data into this really cool looking template, and let's go ahead and get started. So if I pull up the template here on GitHub, we can see that it's just defined as one basically large HTML file, and we're going to go ahead and open that up now and copy the content. And let's go ahead and create a new VS Code workspace for this. All right, really cool. And let's go ahead and open that on up. And we'll create a new, let's just call it template.html. And we'll paste that on in there and show it some love with some formatting. All right, that's starting to look pretty good. Let's go ahead and save it. And just to make sure we've got exactly what we need, we're going to go ahead and open it up here with our live server extension so that we can preview what we're working on. All right, yeah, that looks like pretty much what we saw here on the Tailwind Toolbox website, and it looks pretty solid. All right, so we've got all the pieces that we want to see for our app. Now we need to go ahead and start plugging in the data from our API. We could do everything right here, right inside of the template, right within Alpine, which is actually what I've already done over here. So if we pull up our API response next to this, you can kind of see the use case that we're going to be demonstrating. Each metric is represented by a card, and the icon is based on the metric's type property. The green or yellow color is based on the alarm state for that particular object, and the trend, value, and title are pretty much represented here how you would expect. So if you're familiar with Alpine at all, you'll definitely recognize the development patterns that are enabling this behavior. Up here, I've got xData with a function to fetch from our API. Then xInit performs the first update and then sets an interval for every 2 seconds. And further down, we start to iterate over our metrics with a template tag and x4, and then start plugging in that data using xbind and xtext. This is easy enough, but our markup is definitely starting to look a little bit busy. And all the app does right now is just present us some data. It doesn't actually have any user functions yet, so if I click on any of this stuff, it doesn't do anything. So we're looking right now at about 324 lines of code in our single document here, and we're not even close to the finish line. Also, we've got this really cool metric card here, but it seems like it might be something that we want to use in other parts of our app. And right now, if we wanted to do that, we'd have to copy all of this markup that represents our metric card, and suppose we wanted it somewhere up here or maybe in another document, we need to go ahead and paste it, and also start making adjustments to these things like xbind and xtext depending on the context that we actually need that card in at the time. Then let's suppose that we actually go through and do all of that. What if we decide we want to make a change and we want this to be rounded full instead of just rounded? Well, that will apply no problem here, as we can see, to our iterated instances here inside of our template tag. But if we had that pasted somewhere else, then we need to go ahead and apply this rounded full change to the other instances of that card as well. So you can kind of see how that starts to contribute to fragmentation, and it can really make consistency a challenge, especially if we're talking about changing the styles on something as common as a button or maybe a text field. All right, so we see the issue here. Let's talk about where Presto can help. If we're remembering the hero image back here on the repository, we can see how the markup on the left got broken down into components here on the right. And we can do the exact same thing in our dashboard app. Let's go ahead and try it. Okay, so back in our template, we already know that we're looking for these metric card looking guys right here, and Tailwind Toolbox is really cool. They give us these comments so that we're able to find exactly what we're looking for. And I'm actually gonna pull the entire component here with its div because I want these screen size properties to come along with it. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy that, and just to make sure we've got the right thing, I'm gonna go ahead and open up a new code swing, and we'll paste what we want right on in there. Let's go ahead and bring in Font Awesome because we know we're gonna need that. And I'll just paste right there. And yep, look at that. That's exactly what we wanna see here. So now that we know that we have the right markup, let's go ahead and look at how we're gonna turn this into a component that we can reuse within Presto. Heading back into our workspace here, we're gonna go ahead and pull in Presto via npm. So I'm just gonna run npm install Presto. And while we're waiting on that, I'm actually gonna pull in some of the settings from another workspace I've got open. We'll go ahead and create a new folder here for .vscode. And within there, I wanna go ahead and create a settings.json. And the settings that I'm gonna go ahead and apply are gonna be for our live server extension here. And I'll explain why we're doing this later on, but just kind of follow along for the moment. Okay, great. So Presto's all installed, and to go ahead and generate some pretty generic scaffolding for us, I'm gonna go ahead and run npx presto --init. And we can see over here on the side, it's given us an src directory, then a Presto directory, and then a components directory nested within that, as well as a presto.config.js. It's asking us now, do we want to start with some sample components? I do not, so I'm just going to type in, and then we'll go ahead and clear that out. Okay, so we've got our scaffolding. To get started, let's go ahead and dive a little bit into the presto.config.js. There's plenty of documentation on this in the README, so I'm not going to try to dive too heavily into what all of this means, but there are a couple of things that we are going to need to know to make it through the rest of this tutorial. So our input document, as you might imagine, is where Presto is going to start the compiling process. So if we look back at the hero image here, this would be like the input document. This is the index.html from which all of the other components are expressed, and then they're going to be rendered. So we need to go ahead and create that now within our actual workspace. So let's go ahead and create a new file. And it says it's going to be at src presto index.html. So let's put it there. Okay, perfect. And I'm just going to start with another basic document, just like we had earlier with our code swing. Back to that presto.config.js. It also is giving us an include directive, and this is something that I again won't go too heavily into, but this is where Presto is looking for any components that we've defined and named. And there's a couple of different ways that you can actually go about using or not using this. It's totally up to you. Definitely check out the documentation, but for today, I just want to make it clear that during this demonstration, we're going to use assumed imports, not explicit imports. So our include process is going to take care of any imported components that we need. And that's about all we need to know about this. Output is pretty self-explanatory. So let's go ahead and close out of that. And we're back into our index.html. Well, we've got pretty much the same thing that we looked at in the code swing earlier. I do need to go ahead and pull in Font Awesome. And at some point we're going to use it. So let's go ahead and pull in Alpine by a C in as well. Very good. All right, so we've got our input document. Let's go ahead and define our first component. And we know where those components need to be stored because we saw it in our presto.config.js. So let's go ahead and create a file now. That's going to be an src/presto/components. And I'm going to call it metriccard.html. And great, I think I've still got everything we need on the pasteboard. So, oh, no, I don't. Let's go ahead and pull from, let's see, I think that ought to be it right there. All right, yes, very good. So I've got our markup for our metric card component. And now we just need to let Presto know what we're going to call this component. So in HTML, if you're going to describe something about a document, you would generally describe that particular property using a meta tag. And that's no different in Presto. So I'm going to hit return a couple of times and we're going to define a meta tag up here. I've already got a snippet, so I'm just going to type export and we can see what VS Code has filled in for me. So we've got a new meta tag with an empty Presto attribute and then a name attribute that we're going to define here. And by default, it just calls itself component name because that's what my snippet says. So I've already given a name here that says metriccard.html. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing here. Metric card, but no HTML, of course, because we're just giving the component a name. Now, this is probably a really good time to mention that component names in Presto are case sensitive. So if you decide to adopt a nomenclature, whether that's Pascal case, kebab case, camel case, whatever you like, just try to stick to it throughout your development process, because if you happen to type this instead of, with a capital M, then Presto will not know what to do and it'll just deliver a standard HTML tag that won't actually do anything for you. So yes, these are case sensitive. Just make sure that whenever you're writing your names and then your component expressions that you are consistent. All right, cool. So that's all we need to do to actually tell Presto that we've got a component. So I'm going to save this and let's go ahead and pop back on over to our index.html and let's express our first component. Again, following that case sensitivity. And just for the sake of being consistent, I'm also going to do this as a fully closed tag, not as a self-closed tag. And let's go ahead and hit save. Now we're ready to go ahead and compile and see what happens. So I'm going to pop down to my terminal and run npx presto. And it's telling us it was successful. So if we look at what's at dist index.html, then we can see that Presto has automatically filled in some of the components for our metric card. Now, of course, if we want a better view of this, we need to actually open it in the browser. So I'm going to go ahead and open with live server. And yep, that is exactly what we asked for. So we view these side by side. we can see exactly the same thing. And no, we're not looking at the code swing that I had open from earlier. That is actually the component that we want to see. So really, really cool. We've got this component and we can express it as many or as few times as we want. So if I hit Shift and just copy this a couple of times, hit save, and then back down to our terminal, run npx presto again, then we now have 3 metric cards. Really, really cool. All right, so now that we're getting to the point where we're running our presto command several times, let's go ahead and pull in one of these scripts from our repo here. And yeah, this is what I want, file watching with Nodemon. So we're gonna go ahead and pull in this watch script right here. And this is gonna help us from having to type the same thing over and over again. I'm gonna go ahead and run npm install Nodemon and give that just a second. While that's running, let's go ahead and, oh, look, it's already done. We'll come back over here to our package.json and let's go ahead and run also npm init y. Okay, now we've got some scaffolding to our package.json, and we'll just go ahead and throw our script from the repo right on in there. Okay, that looks good. And now if we run our new command, npm run watch, then Presto will automatically compile every time it sees a change in our Presto directory. Now, if you'll recall from earlier, we had some changes made to our settings.json. And the reason that I did this is because we really only want live server to watch for when Presto has completed compilation of index.html. If we had it watching the entire project root, then every time we save one of our components, it would try to refresh one time. And then once Presto is finished compiling, then it would it would try to refresh once again after the index.html has been written to the dist directory. And that would be pretty annoying to watch happen in the browser and can also lead to some inconsistencies later on. So having this setting applied to our live server really helps out to make sure that we're only looking in one spot for when changes happen. All right, cool. So let's pop back over here and we can see that we've got what we defined earlier in our index.html. And while we're only working with one component, let's go ahead and start playing around with some of the attribute coalescence that we discussed earlier. I'm gonna go ahead and change, we're gonna drop these tailwind attributes here because I want everything to actually be up here at the top, and I kind of want my cards stacked. But I also want them in the middle so that I can get a really nice view of the margins on either side. Traditionally, if we wanted to do this, we could go into our component here and we could just apply mx auto, which is our tailwind attribute for an automatic margin. And yeah, that works, but suppose we don't always want this to be centered. Maybe there are times that we actually do want it here on the left. And if that's the case, then we probably shouldn't have this expressed directly in our component. Instead, let's try applying it on the component expression. So if we say class equal mx auto and hit save, then yes, everything is centered just the way that we want it. And if I take that off of here, then we can uncenter one of them, or if we say ml auto, then we can push one over to the left. Let's try that with this one here. So what's happening here? Well, if we take a look at our metric card component, we can see the basic Tailwind classes that are being applied at the root element. Then if we actually go into our inspector here in Firefox, we can see what Presto is doing to the class attribute for this root element. So if we follow up right about here, we can see that in each instance of our component, and let's make this a little bit smaller, in each instance of our component, we've got exactly what we typed earlier right here. So starting from the top, we've got mx auto, ml auto, and mr auto. And Presto is going to do this again through what's called attribute coalescence. And you can read all about this right here within the README here, and there's all kinds of cool ways that you can control this. We'll go into some of this later on, but right now all you need to know is that you're able to apply attributes straight onto your components, and Presto will make sure that those end up where they belong. So this is really cool, and it's great that we can coalesce attributes, but we also still need to plug in, that data that we talked about getting from our API. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we might do that. I'm going to go ahead and drop my metric card instances here, and I really only want the one that's going to be centered because that's what we're going to be working with later on. If we take a look here at our metric card component, we can see where each different property that we're wanting to express from our API is represented as static markup. So it sounds like we need to define some properties, which is something that is baked right into Presto. Let's go ahead and do that now, and we'll start with our title here, which is currently set to total revenue. We need to make that something dynamic. So I'm going to highlight that text, and let's go ahead and define this as a property. And Presto uses mustache syntax, much like a lot of other frameworks. So let's go ahead and use that. And we'll just call our title. And what else do we have? Oh, here's one for trend. So let's go ahead and call that trend. And the template has the text as green. I actually want this as just a static white. Our value also is going to need to change from time to time. And by that I mean every time. Okay, our icon too, let's go ahead and change that. And then the color is also going to need to change based on the alarm state of the item in our API. And we'll just call that color. Okay, so we're almost done. We've got all of our different properties surrounded by mustache syntax, and now we actually need to declare those properties on the component. So that's done up here in the meta tag, and to do this, all we do is type 2 colons and then the property name. So we'll start with color, icon, title, value, and trend. So you might be asking yourself right about now, okay, I've already done this down here. Why do I now need to go ahead and do it up here? And the answer to that question is to avoid collisions with other frameworks. I am quite aware that Presto is not the only framework that makes use of mustache syntax. If you're using Laravel Blade, then you're all too familiar with mustache syntax, or if you're using Adonis Edge, then you're also using it there as well. And we definitely don't want any properties that we're defining here within Presto to collide with those that you're defining within your applications. Presto is not interested in your app's logic. It's not even interested in your app state. We just want to go ahead and plug in values that we need in our markup. So by defining these up here, we can ensure that Presto has no collisions between what you're defining within your application's logic and what you're just defining here within your markup. Okay, so now that we've got our properties substituted in, we can go ahead and save our component, and things aren't looking so great over there in the preview on our right. No worries, we're going to go ahead and get some property values substituted in right now. So let's pop back over to our index.html, and I don't want to see this anymore, so I can close that. And let's start defining our actual properties on our component. And this is done in exactly the same way that we had them defined in our meta tag. So let's start with our title. And since our API is kind of industrial themed, I'll say our title is total output. And then our color, just for fun, we'll say is yellow. Icon is, I think there's a bolt icon in Font Awesome. Our value is 100,000 megawatts. I don't know if that's realistic. And our trend is going to be up. Let's apply some formatting to make that readable. Hit save. And yep, there it is. So very cool. We've got our different properties in here, and they're being expressed exactly as we would expect them to in the actual component representation. So again, if we dive into our inspector here, we can kind of see what's going on. This corresponds exactly where we thought it would, according to the tokens that we defined within the actual component itself. So if we decided to duplicate this a couple of times, we could now change different properties. And let's say maybe this is purple, and let's say we're monitoring average load. We can use our tachometer icon here. And I have no idea if this is even relevant, but I'll just say 1000 kilowatt hours. And that's gonna be up. Cool, so we'll hit save. And yep, look at that. We've got our new icon here along with a color, and all of the other data that we had populated from the title to the value is also being substituted in. And we didn't have to write any new markup to be able to accomplish that. We just used our same component. Okay, so this is really neat, but we also still need to plug in the data from our API. Right now, all we've really got are static sets of information that we're attaching, and that's excellent, but that's also not going to do much to show us any dynamic data. I'm going to go ahead and keep the static instances of our cards here, and we're going to go ahead and just create a little divider here. Let's see if that looks all right. Yeah, that looks good. And now we need to start actually plugging in the information from our API. So let's go ahead and take one of our metric cards, and we'll go ahead and duplicate it and shift it down beneath our border there. All right. So if that was static, then yeah, that would be good. It's right where we want it. So if we take a look back at the code swing we had earlier, then we can see how we expressed our data using Alpine and our different attributes here. Xbind, Xtext, so on and so forth. Let's go ahead and grab our Xdata and Xinit so that we can recycle that without having to type a whole lot more. So if I come up here and I want to attach that, we'll just do it on the div here and paste that on in. And we've already pulled in Alpine, so we should be good to go. Just for the sake of doing things, I'm going to go ahead and add a console.log, this.metrics to make sure that everything's pulling in. So if I come over here, Command Option I, yep, we can see that we've got our Alpine information coming on in. If we come into our handler, then yep, there's our original target, and all of our data is flowing in nicely. Okay, cool. So we're safe to go ahead and start actually expressing this. We just need to decide how we're going to do that. So if we were to follow the model that we had back in our code swing here, then it looks like we're probably going to need to start editing our actual component. Well, that's fine and you can do it, but if we start to apply Xbind, Xtext, and any other Alpine attributes directly in our component's markup, then we've now lost the ability to use this component outside of an Alpine context. So if we don't have Xdata established on a parent div for wherever that component happens to be expressed, then we can't use that component any longer in our application. We have to make sure it's always inside of an Alpine context. That kind of takes away from the modularity of what we want our components to be. So how about instead of changing the actual markup of the component itself, we instead change the way that we express that component? Let's take a look how. This is something that is probably best first witnessed and then explained later. So I'm going to do my best to explain what I'm doing as I'm doing it, but just know that we'll go a little bit further into detail once we see the result over here on the right. So looking back at our code swing, we know that we're going to need to wrap inside of a template and then use X4, which is pretty intrinsic to anybody that's already used Alpine. Now, of course, we can do that right here, say template, and then start to define that, but we don't have to. Presto provides us with this really nice wrap action attribute that we can go ahead and use and say template. And what this will go ahead and do for us, if I hit save and we watch it render, we can see that our node here actually disappeared. And if we go into our inspector and take a look, we can see that it's actually been wrapped by our template tag. So really cool. We're ready to go ahead and start using this template tag to apply X4. So we already know that the attributes are going to be coalesced onto whatever's inside of our component. So we're safe to go ahead and say x4. And since we're already pulling in data from Alpine, we can go right into saying m in metrics. I'll hit save. And boom, we've got several metric cards here representing everything that we're pulling in from our API. But if you'll take a look, it looks like we've actually lost something, and we indeed have. We've lost our center aligned attribute, even though we've still got MX Auto declared here on our metric card component. For some reason, it's no longer centered in the page. If we take a look at the inspector, and we start diving in here, yeah, where did it go? Here's our component, but oh, there it is right there. So class has instead been applied onto the root element template instead of the actual component markup, which is where we want it. So this would kind of be something that's annoying if Presto didn't already provide for a way to take care of this. Hey, it's Steven from the future, where I'm editing this in Premiere, and I actually realized how wildly inconvenient what I'm about to show you is. And if using Presto takes extra time or feels unintuitive, then it really isn't living up to its name or its intention. Anyway, I stopped editing for a bit to rework the way that the wrap action operates, so what you're about to see isn't actually necessary to accomplish what's intended. However, it's still important to understand how coalescence controls work within Presto, so I'm going to leave this next section in here, and when it's done, I'll cut in again to show you the newer way to accomplish what you're about to see. If we look back into the repo and we read about attribute coalescence control, we've got these 4 different attributes that will help us control the way that coalescence happens. And if we read further on, there's actually this really nice reference sitting down here at the bottom where you can read about even more ways to control the way that this happens. So let's go ahead and make use of a couple of these. We'll go ahead and make use of provides, reserves, and declared, and then accepts. And I'll show you how to use these right now. So if we come back over to our metric card, we're going to go ahead and write in provides. And if we look at our documentation, provide says attributes matching the space delimited list will be distributed to elements or component expressions and not coalesced onto the root component element or expressed as properties. Okay, cool. But we have some properties here, so we need to make sure that we are actually holding on to those. So let's read about reserves. Attributes matching the space delimited list will be coalesced onto the root element or expressed as properties and not distributed to elements or component expressions. Okay, cool. So if we use provides as just a blank attribute, then what this tells Presto is that everything that is going to be expressed on the component here, so literally everything that's right here as an attribute, is going to be skipped as a property definition, and it's going to be skipped as something that would be coalesced onto this root element here, and it's going to be distributed to some other components or some other elements within our component definition. So this is kind of like you can imagine it as a wildcard. So anything that's inside of here would then get distributed according to the way that we say. Well, we still need to hang on to these properties that we have here. We want to make sure that these get substituted in where they belong within our component. So we'll go ahead and use reserves. And that's where we can make use of our declared property here. And what this is going to do is it tells Presto that anything that we've declared here belongs to this component and needs to remain as properties that are going to be expressed within it. So that'll auto-populate for us. We don't need to type out each instance of every single one of these, although we could if we wanted to. Okay, so we're almost done here, but where we have provides, we also need to have accepts. And if we read about accepts here, we can see attributes matching the space delimited list are received for coalescence where given by a provides declaration. Okay, so we already know where we want our attributes to end up. We're looking for this class equals MX auto, and we know we want it to go right onto our root element. So we'll just go ahead and define accepts and hit save. And let's go ahead and take a look to see what we got. All right, so it doesn't look like we have anything at all. What happened? Well, if I right click and I say inspect, we can go ahead and take a look and see what's happening, and we now see that our template tag has lost x4, and that's actually been sent down to our actual root element inside of our component. So we're missing a couple of things here. We can see that it received the wrap attribute, which we didn't want it to receive, and it also received the x4 attribute, which we didn't want it to receive. So let's go ahead and add both of those to reserves. And that way, these will go ahead and wind up where they need to go. We'll hit save. And yep, we're back in business. Okay, so we've got everything centered again, and each one of these cards is iterating over an item in our array from our API. Hey, it's Future Steven again, and as promised, we're gonna pause for just a moment to make it better. So if you watched through that last part, you're probably thinking, wow, that's a lot of work just to use x4. Well, I totally agree with you, so really quickly, I'll show you how to use the updated wrap action. What we're looking at right now is our existing code. We've got wrap and x4 declared here in our index document on our component expression, and within our component document, here are coalescence controls for accepts, provides, and reserves. We're gonna go ahead and remove all of those right now. We'll go ahead and save that. And then within our index document, we'll select both wrap and x4. And we're just gonna push these down so that they're the last attributes declared on our metric card component expression. We'll hit save. And if we check out Firefox, we can see that it's still working. The reason that this works is described in the updated documentation here. When using wrap, any attributes that are declared after wrap is established will be coalesced onto the wrapper element and not onto the component's root element. I think that's both easier and far more intuitive. Of course, there are plenty of circumstances where you'd want to use provides, accepts, and reserves, but wrapping shouldn't be one of them, and as a consequence of this rework, those coalescence controls no longer have any effect on the way that wrap is applied. A good example of where coalescence control could be useful would be something like a labeled input component. Here we've got an input wrapped by a div, and it's a sibling to a label. Well, it can be assumed that most of the attributes you'll want to modify will be on this input component. One such case would be application of a placeholder value or even a type value. By using provides in the component and accepts on the input element, you'll be able to pass placeholder and type directly onto the component expression, like this. Anyway, there are plenty of places where coalescence control can be useful, but for wrapping, let's just keep it simple. Alright, let's finish up the tutorial. We still need to get our data populated in there, so let's take a look at how we might do that. Going back over to our code swing that we had earlier, let's go ahead and borrow some certain things from here. And I'm actually just going to go ahead and copy that entire node. But we're not going to use it, we're just going to use it for reference here. Let's go ahead and go back into full screen, and I'm just going to create a new document. And we can go ahead and push that over to the side here. And I'm just going to paste that for reference so that we're able to grab what we need when we need it. Now, I already promised that we weren't going to change the actual markup within our metric card component, so we were just going to change the expression. It sounds like we're going to need a little bit of magic to be able to pull this off, and that's exactly what we've got. You can read more about magic properties here within the README, but for now, we're just going to kind of hop right through it. To express a magic property, we just add a $sign in front of our property name, and now we can go ahead and express this as if we were working within Alpine. So our title is going to be m.name according to our model over here. And our color, let's see, that one's a little bit more complicated because that refers to the alarm. Let's go ahead and pull this here. If it's in alarm, it's going to be yellow, and if it's not, then it's going to be green. Let's go ahead and copy that, and we can drop that in there. Make sure we add our $sign over here. And our next one, our icon. Oh, this one's pretty complicated here because it's referring to an object and then it keys on the type. Let's go ahead and copy that and drop that into there. And again, add our $sign to make it a magic property, and our value. Oh, m.value, very good. And for our trend, again, that one's a little bit more complicated. uses a ternary operator, and we'll just go ahead and copy that, paste it in here, and make sure that we use our $sign. Now, just looking at this, it seems like this probably isn't going to work, but we're going to try it anyway. I'm going to close out of here, and I don't need to save that. And let's pop back over to our preview, hit save, and see what happens. And in fact, it's working and it is refreshing. Let's take a look. Yeah, we've got our different icons. So our fan is populating for our turbine elements here. And what else have we got? Our flames for our flare stack elements. And for our pump elements, we've got our faucet. And for steam, we've got this cool looking wind thing. And for our radiation, we've got a radiation symbol. So really cool, that's actually working. Now, it's probably a good time to ask, how is this actually happening? Well, if we come back over to our output, we can kind of get a rough idea for what Presto's done. Let's go ahead and split this and we can kind of take a look at what's going on. So here we've got our static versions of our element. We can see that this is our divider here. And we've got our 1000 kilowatt hours, which is represented here. And then right above that is our 100,000 megawatts. Okay, so beneath this is where we have our actual component that's being referenced by Alpine. We can see our template tag that starts. It's referenced here by our wrap, and then it gets X4, which is provided for according to our rules that we've defined in the meta tag up here. Very good. And at this point, we go ahead and start declaring our properties. So because we declared these as magic properties, Presto is going to do some things that are specific to Alpine. So we can start to see that where we've defined our title. If we look over here, where we've declared m.name, it's applied xhtml equals m.name, and it's surrounded this using a template string and then a placeholder element to be able to express that. Moving on to our color, we can see that it's done the same thing, only in this case, it's applied xbind. So how did it do this? If this is XHTML and this is XBind, what's going on? Well, Presto includes context awareness for Alpine applications. So if it detects that our token was inside of the inner HTML, then it knows that when it expresses this property, it needs to use the attribute XHTML. Similarly, if it sees a token inside of an attribute, then it knows that instead of declaring XHTML, it now needs to use XBind. So this is automatically done for you. You don't have to do any thinking on it. If you want something substituted in, just tell Presto here using a magic property, which is expressed using a $sign, and it'll figure out the rest for you. All right, so if it's so smart, what happened down here? If you look at this, you might examine it and say, oh my gosh, what's it doing? This tool is ruining my code. I promise you it's not, it's just taking a couple of shortcuts. So we've got a pretty interesting situation happening here where we've got our property and it's mixed with some markup as well. So instead of including our value inside of a span tag or a div or something else, it's in line with additional markup. Well, if this is going to be dynamically defined, then we would need to have xtext or xhtml defined on this h3 tag here. But if we were to do that, then we would also then lose the rest of this content by substituting in whatever our value is. We would also lose this trend value here that's declared as an italics element and then expressed as font awesome. So instead of dropping all of this, what Presto actually does is it transforms everything into HTML and then converts all of the markup that's inside into HTML safe characters. So if we take a look at our inspector, we can see that all of this actually winds up rendered as plain old HTML. Now, it's super convenient that you can do this, but if I'm being completely honest, I wouldn't make use of this feature very often if I didn't have to. The easier thing to do here, just for the sake of readability, would be to wrap our value inside of a span tag, and we still get the same thing. And if we refresh our index.html here, then we can see that we still get the same thing, only it's a whole lot more readable because Presto didn't have to escape all of this extra information into HTML safe characters. So while you can use that feature, it's one that I kind of just threw in there because it felt like there was the potential to make mistakes. But if you really want to make your applications easier to debug in the long run, and you won't have to deal with any of those HTML safe characters, just take the extra 2 or 3 seconds, wrap any of these values that are representing mixed content that you know you're going to want to use with magic properties, and just wrap them in something like a span tag or a div, wherever it suits you. Alright, so I'm currently staring at VS Code on one display, and then to my left, I've got Premiere Pro, which is currently sitting at a timecode of 42 minutes and 59 seconds. If I'm being totally honest, that's a lot longer than I initially thought this video was going to be, and I don't want to shoot myself in the foot by scaring off interested developers with a video duration that seems like it'll take a huge chunk of their day. I realize that everyone's time is valuable, and as developers, we never seem to have enough of it, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here for now. We've built a pretty rough idea of how components are defined with properties, magic properties, attribute coalescence, and how that all plays into Alpine, and that's a really good start. There's a whole lot more, including things like slots and pipe properties, so definitely go take a look at the repo and the README that's here if you want a closer look. While you're there, be sure to also check out the demo app, ExpressLane, which is totally built with Presto and Alpine and does a pretty good job of showcasing components and how you can go about building a complete app front end with Alpine. I've actually got it running here on my system, and you can see it's totally decked out with things like placeholders, and it's, again, totally built with Alpine. Everything here does work, and you can even see how to accomplish things like modals with neat little animations like that, switching between views. And all of these little components are, of course, available in the repo for you to recycle and use in your own applications. So feel free to check this out. It's pretty cool. All of this is 100% Alpine, Tailwind, and Presto. Of course, I want to thank you all for watching. Presto has been something that has had basically all of my attention since around mid-December of 2020, and I'm really excited to get some other developers using it and getting everyone's feedback. It is my first attempt at jumping into open source, so any pointers are greatly appreciated. If you like this video and want to see more, definitely give it a thumbs up and leave a comment. I'm more than happy to make some other tutorials if there's interest. Also, I feel like I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say, if you like where the project is going and want to see more, please do consider becoming a sponsor. I won't deny that developing this was incredibly expensive, as I had to take a lot of time off of work as a freelancer. But I definitely enjoyed myself and learned a lot along the way. So if you feel like Presto can save you time or money, please definitely consider becoming a sponsor. All right, y'all, that is it for today. Come visit the repo. If you want to send me a direct message, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Steven Casas there and just about everywhere else. And I promise to start tweeting a little bit more often because it's looking a little bit empty here. But come say hey, and I can't wait to hear from everybody. I'll see y'all next time.